Evelyn watched the grainy clip once, twice, and felt the room tilt beneath her. A janitor's hand on Luke's shoulder. A small touch that smelled of both kindness and accusation. She signed the termination before her coffee cooled, believing certainty was protection. Then the MRI came back lesion. Someone in her company had already mailed the worst frame to the press. By morning, a man had lost his job, and Evelyn had to choose: protect her name or tell the whole truth. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Evelyn Hart stood very still by the window, as if the glass might break her apart and show all the pieces inside. Dawn had soaked the city in a tired gray, rain threading quiet rivers down the panes. Her office tower rose like a folded blade above the streets, all steel and mirror, catching the first cold light and throwing it back in sharp lines. From here she could see the river below, the bridges, the thin row of trees that would turn gold in another month. From here the world looked ordered, like one of her spreadsheets, neat columns, predictable numbers. Inside her chest the numbers did not add up. She wore a suit that cost more than most people made in a year. The fabric sat on her shoulders like armor. Her name was on the building in brushed letters: Hartwell. To the city, she was a fact, a woman who had made a company grow until it swallowed competitors and headlines. To boardrooms, she was a mind of ice in motion, a person who did not tolerate loose ends. To herself, she was something weathered, a map of choices with tiny burned edges. Her fingers closed around a small blue sock. It was damp from where she had, absently, wiped her face with it the night before. Luke's sock. Luke was 7, a boy who at 3 could already tell the difference between carry-on luggage brands, and who at 5 had learned to whistle on purpose. He slept in the room down the hall, the thin door left open for a steady stream of nightlight and the distant city hum. She had not slept well. She had not slept because sleep felt like surrender lately. A quiet sound from the bedroom, the soft rustle of sheets, made her shoulders lower for the briefest second. The maternal reflex that had first come to her like a tide was still present under the steel. It made decisions feel larger. It made them moral. It made them personal. She rubbed the back of her neck and watched her reflection in the glass. Her eyes looked younger from far away, but up close they held small, stubborn creases. Evelyn could see the burn mark of a long night at the hospital years ago, the worry lines that never fully smoothed out. She saw the hint of a bruise of fatigue around her left jaw where she habitually clenched. She tasted exhaustion like metal. Her phone lay on the desk, screen face down. On it were messages and memos and the kind of legalese that moved people, mergers and contracts, and the noise of a life lived in bullet points. This morning, it held something else, a note from Human Resources, time-stamped, a terse record of a termination. Her finger hovered over the edge of the desk, as if touching it could change the past. They had all seen it. The security tapes, the file on her assistant's desk with the still frames, and the one shaky clip someone had sent from a corner camera. The janitor, dirty shirt, tired hands, name stamped on the ledger, had been near Luke after school, a hand on the boy's shoulder that looked like it should have been comfort, but read wrong in the grain of the grainy footage. Hours of heated emails, 2-hour meetings, a threat of scandal. The board whispering about lawsuits and reputation and children. The janitor had been escorted out that night. Power is its own kind of loneliness. It asks for decisions to be made quickly so they can be defended later. Evelyn had made one. She had called security herself. She had signed the notice. She had watched the man leave with his belongings in a plastic bag. Everyone needed certainty. She had given them certainty. And yet certainty is a brittle thing. It fits in your hands until it cracks. There had been a second image, one that no one seemed to look at long enough. A man, older than the boy, but younger than she had assumed, stooped to tie a shoe. The timing of the clip made it ambiguous. The sound of a child's laugh. The look on Luke's face, in one frame proud, in another small and uneasy. Evelyn had seen both. Most people saw only the first, the quick frames that supported the version they wanted to believe. She had seen them all. She had decided in the space between a breath and the next breath. Outside the window, a delivery truck sighed its brakes. The city continued its small, indifferent rituals. A bus spilled commuters, a dog tugged at its leash. A cafe opened its doors and added the rich hint of coffee to the rain. The building's lobby would soon fill, briefcases brushed, umbrellas folding, shoes tapping on stone floors. Her life was one temperature, always warm enough to make others feel the heat of consequence. She had been raised on hard choices. Her mother had taught her that fairness meant swift action, that power without decisiveness was worse than no power at all. The lesson had been simple and cruel. Do not let people hurt what is yours. Protect the small things with the same hand you use to steer large deals. But protection blunts, like a blade left in salt. It needed sharpening now, and she was not sure which stone to use. A sound that was not the city reached her. Luke's low, small voice calling out a sleep-hungry question. "Mama?" She answered without turning. "I'm here, love." The words slipped out unsteady. He padded into the doorway in his pajamas, hair a smudged halo. He climbed into her lap, tiny arms grappling around her neck, and for a moment nothing in the world had more meaning than the weight of his body. He smelled like shampoo and the faint sweet of a child's snack. He hummed a tune that made no sense to anyone older, and she let the noise of the company fall away like clothes in the rain. "Will you stay?" he asked, voice thick. 7-year-old logic wrapped in fear. "I will stay," she said. It was the promise of a mother who keeps vigil. It was also a vow the CEO could not keep at all times. There were meetings scheduled at 9, investors with lines of teeth, a court of public opinion that fed uncertainty. She sat with the contrast between the two worlds like a coin on her palm, the gold face that everyone admired and the other side tarnished, secret. Luke's fingers traced the line of her watch. He had a child's habit of inspecting useful things that belonged to adults. "You're tired," he said, simple and acute. "Yes." She let the word be the truth. "But being tired is not for you." He sighed and curled against her. For the longest time, silence held them, a small island of two in the middle of her mapped life. The narrator, if one could call it that, noticed the little facts with the patience of someone cataloging bones. That she never drank coffee past noon because it made her restless, that she collected old maps and kept them rolled under her bed, that she folded her son's socks loosely because anything too tight made him angry. The narrator kept such data alongside the bigger scenes, impartial, a ledger of small kindnesses that existed even in people who made awful choices. Evelyn tightened her arms just a bit. Control and tenderness lived together in the same chest, and neither wanted to give the other ground. She had not told Luke about the man who had been fired. She had not told him because she did not know how to explain the shape of fear without making it bigger. She had not told him because the truth felt like wood splintering in her hands, sharp and unexpected. Downstairs, in the corridor that smelled of lemon cleaner and the wet concrete of early morning, a mop waited against the stainless steel. A name tag pinned by a safety pin glinted in the fluorescent light. Daniel Reed, if anyone cared to read it. For Daniel, mornings began and ended with small tasks that left no mark on the news. For Evelyn, mornings began with decisions that would decide other people's lives. Between the glass tower and the tiled corridors, between the high suites and the world beneath, there was a seam. It was thin as thread and under tension. Something had crossed it. Something might cross it again. She listened to the rain on the glass and felt the city breathe. The story, if it wanted to be cruel, was only just beginning to pull at the threads. The phone in Evelyn's pocket buzzed like an insect that would not be shooed away. She had been counting heartbeats since dawn, calculating, measuring, keeping watch. But the sound made every number scramble. She read the caller ID with a dry, sudden cold. St. Augustine School. Her breath left her like a small, sharp thing. "You need to come," said the voice on the line. Luke fainted. He's awake now, but pale. "We called an ambulance." The words arrived thin and chemical, like a lab result you do not want to read. Evelyn hung up and did not think. The city blurred beneath the car, as if someone had smeared oil across its face. She drove too fast for the rain, her hands tight on the wheel, the suit now something she wished she could peel off and leave in the gutter. In the rearview mirror, she rehearsed things she would say and things she would not. She knew the right language for investors and for lawyers. She did not know the right language for blood and small bones. At the hospital, the quiet was a different kind of loud. The fluorescent lights hummed like distant bees. Nurses moved with efficient softness. Luke lay on a narrow bed, eyes half closed, the skin over his cheeks pale as rice paper. A fever bead of sweat gathered at his hairline. His small hand clung to the edge of the sheet like a child who had something precious to hold on to and was afraid to let go. Evelyn knelt beside him. Her voice broke when she spoke. "Luke." He answered with a whisper that did not fit the boy, who could out-whistle the kettle. "Mama." The word was small as an apology. A pediatrician came to sit by them, a woman with patient eyes and a voice that came in calm, slow pieces. She asked routine questions. Had there been a fall? Any vomiting? Any odd behavior? Evelyn remembered a moment 3 nights ago when Luke had winced while tying his shoe. She had thought it was nothing. She had been thinking of a board meeting, of a sharp shareholder's email. She had been thinking of Daniel being escorted out, of reputations and sightlines. She had not been thinking of symptoms. He complained of a headache, Evelyn said finally. The doctor made a note. Tests had begun, quick and precise. Blood draws a monitor across Luke's chest, a watchful, clean efficiency. The doctor spoke the words MRI with the same neutral tone she used for ordering a sandwich. But in Evelyn's ears, that word reverberated like a bell being struck at the bottom of a well. While they waited for the imaging schedule, a nurse stepped out into the corridor and returned with a folder. Inside was a statement from the school counselor. Luke, the counselor's note said, had been quiet lately. He had been more clingy at times and withdrawn at others. He had refused to play with a group on the playground. He had said once to the counselor something that could be read 2 ways. "He touched me." The scribbled line read, the handwriting careful and small. Evelyn's mouth went dry. The memory of security footage of a janitor's hand on Luke's shoulder flashed across her mind like an old, faulty projector. She had seen that frame and had acted. She had seen what many had seen, a man near a child in a way that frightened them. She had done what her upbringing and her instincts told her to do. She had removed the danger. But now there was another detail in the counselor's file. The counselor had asked Luke to show where he had been touched. His finger had pointed to the right temple, the edge of his hairline, not an arm, not an unwanted hand on a shoulder. The counselor wrote that the boy had blinked a few times then and looked at the counselor's face as if he had said something curious. Evelyn felt the floor of certainty shift. She had thought she had acted on something clear. The counselor's note made the edges of things fuzzy, like water on a window. The MRI came back scheduled for later that evening. The hours between were filled with a peculiar vigil. Friends from the company texted condolences and short, sharp advice about statements. Her assistant, Mark, sent an unreadable line. "Call me when you can." The board sent a lawyer. The lawyer sent a paper to sign. People were protective in different languages. Some used the language of power, some the language of grief. All demanded speed. Alone in the waiting room, Evelyn watched other families. A man held his child and read to him in a voice meant to be brave. A woman paced and tapped numbers into a phone like a Morse code. The narrator, impartial now, noting the scene with a cool ledger, recorded facts. Evelyn's hands trembled when she touched her coffee. The ring she wore caught the fluorescent light and threw off a small, sharp reflection. The heart monitor's beep threaded through the room like a metronome for time slowed. The first twist came disguised as a courtesy. A security officer from Hartwell arrived, his coat still damp from the rain. He was not there as a corporate sentinel. He seemed almost apologetic, an employee who had spent his night avoiding the television. He handed Evelyn a small envelope, its flap unsealed. Inside were still frames from the building's cameras, angles she had seen before and others she had not. One frame showed Daniel, the janitor, leaning close to Luke in the lobby. In another frame, Daniel was seen tying his own shoes beside a bank of lockers, his head bent, his hands occupied. The angles overlapped and contradicted each other like overlapping truths. "Someone asked me to pull these," the officer said. He would not say who. The presence of the frames now, delivered in private, felt like the first note of a second song. There was a hand at work here that liked to move pieces quietly. In the sterile glow of the hospital corridor, someone else's motive started to take shape in Evelyn's mind. She thought of PR, of lawyers, of the board, a group whose faces, until recently, had been so helpful in turning the world into order. She thought of the ease with which she had made Daniel's termination official. She thought of how the office had sighed with relief when the threat to reputation seemed tamed. Betrayal is often patient, she thought, and now the thought was not a phrase, but a small, cold object settling into her palm. She had made a choice that pleased many. She had not looked long enough into the places where truth hides. Luke's MRI would tell a story of its own. The doctor explained that images would reveal soft things, swelling, an old scar, a bleed. It would tell whether the head had been harmed in a way that could explain his complaints. It might show nothing. An image can be quiet. An image can be loud. For Evelyn, the MRI felt like a throat cleared in a crowd. As they wheeled Luke into the scanner, the room narrowed, the world becoming the drum of the machine and the small, brave shape of her son inside. The empathetic narrator took over then, lending voice to what reasoning could not reach. A mother's prayer that reality bend to good sense, that her son be whole, that her hands, which had done so much harm in the name of protection, might still be allowed to hold innocence. The scanner hummed and the world condensed. Evelyn pressed her forehead to the glass of the viewing window and saw a boy turning his face toward her in one of those frames where a child tries to be brave for a mother's eyes. She thought of Daniel's face when he left, open, a slate of tiredness, an ache she now could not read without new suspicion. She thought of the small blue sock still on the desk. She could not tell which version of truth would arrive in the next hours. The clean, simple story that matched the security files and corporate memos, or a different, more tangled tale that would ask her to admit folly. Outside in the rain, the city kept its rituals. Inside, in the sterile heart of the hospital, a new kind of test had begun. The inciting event was not simply the boy's fainting. It was the way it had pulled apart the neat lines Evelyn had drawn between home and office, between public image and private fear. It pulled at threads that led down into stairwells where mops leaned and into boardrooms where people smiled because they had to. Someone wanted certainty. Someone else wanted the story to stop. The MRI would not be a verdict so much as a hinge. It would swing things one way or the other. And as the machine clicked and the images built up in quiet layers, Evelyn understood something else that made her chest ache. Every choice she had made now had consequences that would touch not only her name, but the lives folded inside it. Evelyn woke before the sun and could not find the shape of rest. The day had a thickness to it, as if the air in the apartment sat heavy with things unsaid. Luke slept still in his bed, the night light painting a soft halo around his small face. She watched him breathe and tried to count the ribs of her worry, like beads. Each bead made a kind of noise inside her. Fear, shame, resolve. And none of them felt clean. Mark arrived at 9, early and brisk and smelling faintly of lemon. always the smell of someone trying to present order. He had been at Evelyn's side for 6 years, sharp, useful, the kind of assistant who cradled schedules like rare glass. He carried a tablet that hummed with unread messages. When he saw Evelyn in the living room, he did not pretend surprise. Business had trained him to read faces the way others read clocks. "How is he?" Mark asked the question efficiently, tidy. "He's stable," Evelyn said. "They're running tests." Mark sat and folded his hands. "There's pressure downstairs. The board wants a statement. PR says we should be careful with the language. Avoid specifics. No admission of liability. Investors are asking if this will hurt the share price." His voice had the same flatness he used for quarterly reminders. It was a vocabulary Evelyn knew and could use like armor. "What did you pull from security?" she asked, trying to make her voice colder than she felt. Mark's fingers hovered over the tablet. He showed her frames she had not seen, a different angle of the lobby, another stretch of corridor. In one frame, Daniel stooped to tie his shoe, head down. In another, he reached toward a spill on the floor, rag in hand. The moments were benign, ordinary. They argued with the single clip people had used to say the worst. "Someone asked for these," Mark said. "I imagine it will help." Evelyn looked at the frames and felt the world tilt. "Someone." Her voice was small. Mark did not answer directly. He had the habit of being practical when things needed moral weight. "We can release these, or we can keep them private. Either way, there will be a narrative. There will be something in the press." He tapped the screen. "If we show the frames that show he was tying his shoe, it undercuts the claim that he was. It helps your position." "And if it doesn't?" Evelyn asked. "If the MRI says something else?" "If the MRI says something else, we'll have to respond differently," Mark said. His eyes slid to hers in a movement she knew like the hinge of a door. "Evelyn, the company matters. Your name matters. We need to think about the procedure." There in the apartment, with the smell of lemon and Luke's quiet breathing, Evelyn felt both grateful for Mark's steadiness and lonely in a way no board meeting could fix. She loved Mark. She trusted him mostly. But trust was not the same thing as certainty. She could feel the space in their bond where a secret might hide. At the hospital, Dr. Mason explained the results in terms that tried to be neutral, but could not fully temper the tremor in Evelyn's fingers. The MRI showed a small contusion near the right temporal lobe, the kind that could arise from a fall or an impact. "Not uncommon," he said, with the clinical tone of someone who handled emergencies with a steadying voice. "We can treat swelling. We'll monitor him." Evelyn listened and heard the world pool around the single fact. Her son had an injury. It was not a verdict of guilt or innocence. It was two edges of the same blade waiting to be used. She felt both relief and fresh terror. Relief that it was treatable, terror that it gave form to the counselor's note. If a fall could explain it, did that mean she had jumped too fast? If it could not, what other forces had touched her child? Daniel kept to the edges of the narrative in the way men who live with little notice often do. Present, bowed, visible when necessary, and invisible when convenient. He had returned to the building that afternoon to pick up a small box of his things, clothes, a thermos, personal items folded and placed in a bag. He moved with the gait of someone who had been used to carrying weight. He lived alone, the ledger showed. A man with a quiet past, but a steady work ethic. When the security guard had let him out, there had been no shouting, only a kind of shame that settled into the lines of his face. Daniel met Evelyn in the lobby that evening with eyes that did not ask for much. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, honest. He stopped, as if he had rehearsed the sentence and lost the end of it. "Daniel," Evelyn said. Saying his name aloud felt like untying something in her chest. She held his gaze. Were you near my son?" He nodded. "Yes. I always see the kids after school. I sweep. I help carry chairs sometimes. I tie my shoes near the locker bank. I talk to them when they are shy. I would never put my hands where they don't belong." His words were spare and had the weight of truth a man who had to earn respect daily often bore. "Why did you have your hand on his shoulder that day?" Evelyn asked. She needed an answer that would not simply be good enough for the board, but good enough for the small boy who slept in her apartment. "Because he looked like he was going to fall," Daniel said. "He was wobbling. I steadied him." He rubbed a thumb along the seam of his jacket, a small anxious gesture. "That's all." Evelyn wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold the clean narrative in her hands and breathe. But she also felt the weight of what she had already set into motion. She had called security. She had signed a termination letter. She had watched a man walk out with his world's small things in a plastic bag. That night at home, she read the counselor's words again and again until the ink blurred. She thought of the look on Luke's face in the security still that had started the chain. She thought of Daniel's face in the corridor. She thought of Mark tapping the tablet like a man who could shape how the story landed. Tension braided through those thoughts like a tight rope. Mark's loyalty was not blind. He kept his own counsel and once, in another life, had let a partner go when the numbers demanded it. He had a private compass that pointed toward the survival of the firm, which in their case meant the public image of Hartwell and the inward logic of survival. Sometimes that compass lined up with Evelyn's heart. Sometimes it did not. Evelyn found herself listening for nuances in conversation she had previously missed. She listened to Mark's pauses and to the curt politeness of the board's lawyer, Sandra, who called to ask for a copy of Luke's medical reports. Sandra's tone had the coolness of someone who practiced attachment as a defense. "We must proceed carefully," she said. "Statements can be construed." In the lawyer's words was the shadow of calculation that made Evelyn's mouth dry. As the days passed, alliances formed and shifted in the small orbit around Evelyn. The board offered counsel and pressure. PR offered language and spin. Mark offered protection and selective transparency. Daniel offered a simple remorse that felt like raw clay. Luke offered the mute honesty of a child who only asked to feel safe. Evelyn offered decisions, which now felt like cards played in a hand she both controlled and had already set on fire. At night, when the apartment fell to a hush and her son slept again, Evelyn found herself writing lists of what to say and what not to say. She found that each list betrayed something about her: a readiness to protect reputation, a reflex to act, and an aching, slow-growing sense that she had perhaps rushed when caution might have served better. She understood that leadership demanded choices that sometimes hurt others, and she wondered if the hurt would one day return to a place she could not heal. The narrator watched with the cold patience of cataloging and saw the threads forming: a woman who loved her son and feared the world's appetite, an assistant who guarded the company like a second pulse, a janitor whose life had been uprooted by one image in which context had been lost, a school counselor whose note had the power to steer a life. Each person moved with motives that were not wholly bad or wholly good. They were human, layered, and fallible. There were hints of betrayal threaded through ordinary actions. An envelope quietly delivered, a frame pulled and offered to the right person, a lawyer's suggestion that sounded less like legal counsel and more like containment. Evelyn felt the shape of something closing, an arrangement of pieces that would not be undone by apologies. She felt the hunger of reputations, the way they swallowed nuance to stay whole. Underneath, a different question grew like a root. Who had wanted certainty so badly that they would cut corners to get it? The idea sat heavy and felt dangerous. It suggested that the truth might not only be complicated, it might be shaped by hands that had something to gain. Evelyn moved through the days with a double set of responsibilities: the CEO who must defend the company and the mother who must cradle a child. At times they were aligned. At times they pulled her in opposite directions. The world required a verdict. The heart required mercy. Between them, she was learning that some decisions are not single acts, but small betrayals repeated. To call security before listening. To choose the clean version of events because it keeps the house from burning. She did not yet know who would betray whom. She only knew that the story had left the waiting room and moved into corridors where people kept both secrets and truths, and that every person she trusted carried within them the capacity to change everything. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with the envelope spread open like a small accusation. Rain had begun again, soft and steady, and each tiny drumbeat on the window seemed to mark the seconds of a life shifting. She had already seen the frames once, twice. She had already lived with their bluntness. Now she hovered over the edges of the paper, as if touching it might change the ink. Something in the timing made her stop. She had a ledger of small facts in her head: who had come to the hospital, who had called, what Mark had done that morning. And one of those facts had shifted in the margins of the day. The security officer had told her, almost as an afterthought, that someone asked me to pull these. Someone. The word had slid into her like a grain of sand. She had not asked. Who had asked? She picked up her phone and dialed Mark's number with a precision that felt physical. He answered in 2 rings, breath warm through the line. Evelyn. How? Who asked you to pull the footage? Her voice was quieter than she meant it to be. A pause, a small rustle. Someone on the board. They were worried about the story. We needed all angles. You asked the board to pull footage? The words came out as disbelief, a soft blade. No, Mark said it fast. They asked me. Evelyn, this is messy. I thought it was the best way to protect you and the company. He tried to make his tone practical. It sounded small beside her rising panic. Why wasn't I told? She asked. Why did the security guard hand me these like some secret? I thought you'd prefer to see them here. He swallowed. I thought you needed them in private. Look, I'm sorry if it looks like I hid things. I didn't hide anything. His voice trailed uneven. She had trusted Mark for years. He was the steady hand that smoothed rough edges in boardrooms, the voice that knew when to ring a bell and when to sit silent. He had been at her elbow during every merger, every sleepless night. She imagined him as a compass that always pointed towards the firm's survival. Now that compass felt like it had been turned without her knowledge. Come in, she said. Now. When he arrived, he smelled of coffee and rain. He carried himself like a man who had rehearsed his guilt. Up close, his face held the signs of loss, tight lines around the mouth, a quiet that used to be rare. What did you do, Mark? Evelyn asked as if the question could unpack the day. He sat and looked at her as if pleading for air. I pulled the full archive, he said. I looked through hours. There were frames that showed Daniel tying his shoe, frames that showed him sweeping near the locker. Those were harmless. But there was one shorter clip, real short, where he reaches toward Luke. In that pause it looks bad. I sent that to PR. I thought, he stopped. I thought if people were going to panic, we needed a simple truth to hold. I did it to stop the bleeding. You chose one clip, she said. You chose the worst one and gave it to the world. No, I didn't give it to the world. He rubbed his palms together. I gave it to the PR team. I told them to include the frames that made the situation look clear. We needed clarity. You made my decision for me, Evelyn whispered. It felt like frost on her tongue. I made it for both of us, Mark said. Evelyn, the board was pressing. Investors were calling. They wanted certainty. They thought what? She asked, fury growing, not elegant but raw. That killing a man's job would be easier than facing a messy truth. Mark flinched. We thought it would stop the rumor mill, he said. We thought we could control the narrative. I thought I was protecting you. He folded his hands and, for a long moment, said nothing. Outside, a bus passed and hissed like a long exhale. Luke's small footsteps upstairs made a faint sound, pacing, perhaps, or just the gait of a child who felt the house was different. Who told you to do that? Evelyn demanded finally. Who told you to release the clip and not the whole hour? The board, Mark said. Sandra pushed. She said, strictly, we must protect the company. She said a clear story will save us. She told me to be careful who saw the footage. She said we could decide later whether to release more. Sandra said it would look better if we controlled the frame. Evelyn felt the room tilt. Sandra, the lawyer she had relied on for years, a woman with polished arguments and a face that had never betrayed heat, was the very person Evelyn had trusted to keep things honest. Now Sandra's tone, that practiced cool, had become the hammer in the mechanics of a life. The board had asked for certainty, and a lawyer had ordered a narrative. "Show me the messages," Evelyn said. Mark's mouth went dry. He fumbled for his tablet, fingers clumsy. He opened a thread, minutes and emails that looked like ordinary business. Then one he had hoped she would not find, a short, brisk message to Sandra the night before. He read aloud because the silence between them felt loud. "Pull the clip. We need something simple. Daniel's face will do the rest." He swallowed. She replied, "Done. Keep it contained." The betrayal had a new shape. It was not simply Mark choosing to shield her. It was an organized effort, procedural and calm, to sculpt reality. They had chosen the piece of film that best fit the story they wanted to be true, the cleaner story that would not fracture share prices or headline the boardrooms. They had taken a man's livelihood and placed it on a tabletop to be weighed against reputation. Evelyn thought of Daniel's hands, calloused, steady, and of the plastic bag he had carried when security had let him out. She thought of the way he had claimed, simply and plainly, that he had only steadied a wobbling child. She thought of the frames Mark had kept hidden, the ones showing Daniel bending, checking, moving away, frames that told a different story. She imagined them stacked behind the chosen clip like an unplayed chorus. "How could you?" she asked Mark, but the question felt too small. The deeper question, how many times had decisions been made like this under her name, without her knowledge, sat like a stone in her gut? Mark's eyes filled. "I didn't want you to lose control," he said. "I didn't want the board to panic and do something worse. I thought I was doing the least harmful thing." "The least harmful thing for whom?" Evelyn asked. "For the company? For you? For me?" He had no answer. He had only the resignation of a man whose moral ledger had finally run out. Later that evening, Evelyn replayed the footage alone in her office, feeling each frame like a verdict and a plea. The chosen clip held its power, brief, sharp, the angle unforgiving. Then she found, in a corner folder Mark hadn't meant to label plainly, the full hour. She watched Daniel's movements, unspool and patient, ordinary cadence. He bent to tie a shoe. He straightened. He picked up a rag and wiped a small wet patch from a floor. He stooped and brushed a strand of hair from a little girl's face in a way that was careful and measured. At one point he touched Luke's shoulder, but only to steady him as the boy tripped over a lobby step. The touch was quick and protective, not invasive. The frames flowed like water and undercut the single moment that had been presented as truth. Evelyn felt her throat close. She had acted with a speed that now looked like haste. She had allowed her fear and her duty to outrun the full information. She had signed a termination letter that had sent a man into the rain with his few things and no context. The weight of that knowledge landed on her like a lead. Then, with a new small terror, she realized how fragile the line between power and violence had been in that office. They had weaponized a frame. They had made an image serve an outcome. The betrayal was not merely that Mark had lied. It was that the structures she ran had chosen expediency over truth. There was one more blow. As she searched for the thread of messages, she found one more exchange, a short line between Sandra and an email marked with a lawyer's seal. The subject read, "Containment confirmed." The body was a single line, handled. Reputation intact. Expect minimal fallout. It was clinical, clean, and final. Evelyn sat back in her chair and let the room blur. Luke's breathing upstairs sounded unchanged, as if a child's innocence could remain separate from the calculus of adults. But she knew it could not. Every decision she had made to protect an image now felt stained. The betrayal was not a single knife. It was a network of small, efficient cuts. She felt anger, yes, hot and bright. But beneath it, a quieter agony. The knowledge that she had failed in the simplest way a parent could fail, to look fully before pushing someone away. The betrayal was complicated by intent. Mark had believed he was protecting her. Sandra had believed she was protecting the company. They had all been working from a map where the shortest route was the most important. Evelyn pressed her fingertips to her lips and closed her eyes. The story she had been living was shifting into another direction. One where she would have to decide whether to expose what had been done in her name, to own the mistake, and to face whatever fallout came. Or she could keep the structure they had built and continue to let the company's survival dictate morality. Outside, the rain kept its steady rhythm, indifferent to the human arithmetic within the glass. Inside, Evelyn felt the first cold of a truth she had not been willing to hold. That leadership could become its own kind of betrayal when it cut lives for convenience. She had to choose now whether to be the kind of leader who hides the hard edges, or the kind who lifts them into the light, even if the light burns. The days folded over each other like pages in a book someone else was writing. Every morning Evelyn woke to the same small light in Luke's room and the same heavy quiet in the apartment that told her the world had not yet fixed itself. Luke sleeps more fitfully now, waking sometimes with his small face pinched in a way that used to mean a scraped knee and now meant something unnamed. He pressed his forehead to her hand and asked for water in a voice that trembled. Each time she soothed him, the word sorry lodged in her throat like grit. The office felt like a different building. Where it had once hummed with market momentum, it now thrummed with urgent meetings and whispered strategies. The lobby smelled of lemon cleaner and tension. Visitors scanned their passes with hands that trembled, and junior staffers moved in a careful choreography, glancing toward Evelyn with a mixture of pity and calculation people reserve for those whose reputations might crack. On the third day after the MRI, the board called a special meeting. They gathered in a glass room with a table like a flat, solemn heart. Sandra sat at one end, immaculate and clinical, her legal pad open like a Bible she had learned to read carefully. Investors appeared on the screen in coded squares, their faces made small by distance, but sharp in judgment. Mark stood by the door, his expression a mix of contrition and calculation. He had lost some light from his eyes. The part of him that used to joke to cut the tension had retreated. "We need a statement," said William Carter, a board member whose voice had the bluntness of someone used to concrete. "We cannot have this drag out. Shareholders are asking for reassurance. We cannot afford unchecked narratives." Evelyn listened. The world of numbers had always fit her muscles. The language of reputation had been her native tongue. Now those tools felt blunt. She could craft a statement that would soothe investors, deliver the right metrics, and contain legal risk. She could also own what had happened and risk losing everything she had built. The choice lay there, bright and impossible. Sandra's voice was cool. "We should not admit any wrongdoing. We should emphasize that we acted swiftly and in the child's best interest. Release the selective footage that shows a concerning interaction." She tapped her pen. Control is essential. A small hand on Evelyn's heart tightened. Control. The word had become a snare. Behind Sandra's clinical language, Evelyn could already see the headline. Hartwell CEO clears building of threat. She could see the market reaction and the press release composed like a shield. She could see Daniel's world collapsed, his silence replaced by the hollow clack of a lost job's consequences. She could also see her son's face in the MRI, an injury that had names and causes, none of which sat easily under Sandra's plan. "Or we can postpone publicly assigning blame until we have full facts," Evelyn said into the room. Her voice surprised her with how steady it sounded. "We owe that to the people involved." Sandra's eyes narrowed. Delaying invites speculation, and speculation is dangerous. If we look indecisive, the market will punish us. Mark looked at Evelyn as if expecting her to sign some paper and set the machinery back in motion. People she had trusted had already acted without her fully knowing. Now she realized the machinery would not stop at her refusal. Pressure from investors could turn to pressure on her. The moral calculus was no longer academic. It had teeth. Outside the building, a small group of parents had begun to gather. One mother muttered into a phone. Another read a piece of paper with lines underlined. The whispers threaded the school and the building and slipped into the media. A local reporter called Mark and hinted at the frames he had seen. "We've got parent upset," the voice said. "We're going to run a piece unless you give us a statement." "You can't control every outlet," the reporter added, as if that were a consolation. On the other side of the city, Daniel had met with a legal aid volunteer named Rachel. She had a kind patience and a file folder full of forms. Daniel's hands shook as he pushed the folder across the table. He spoke in short sentences. "I didn't do anything," he said. "They just took my bag and left me. My kids, my rent, everything." Rachel listened and filed. "We can file for wrongful termination," she said. "And if the footage shows more context, we can ask for an injunction to prevent further release of edited clips." Daniel's voice was simple. "I want my job." Back at Hartwell, the small escalations compounded. The PR team proposed a tightly worded press release and a staged interview with Evelyn that would show sympathy and stern leadership. "You apologize for any harm and you reinforce zero tolerance," the PR director advised. "Then you pivot to the company's values." "Values," Evelyn mouthed. The word felt like a fragile thing, something you could fold like origami into many shapes. Was it integrity? Or convenience dressed as virtue? At home, late at night, Luke's nightmares became clearer in the way he woke up shaking and called for Evelyn. He spoke of shadows in the lobby and of a tall man's hand he could not see clearly. Sometimes he cried in sleep, and Evelyn's arms felt like thin armor. She began to watch him like a hawk, measuring his responses, noting the way he touched his temple when he chewed breakfast. A small gesture that could mean anything and yet felt large. Dr. Mason recommended more testing. "A contusion can be tricky," he said. "We should monitor for changes in cognition, in balance, in behavior. If headaches persist, we'll refer to a pediatric neurologist." More tests meant more time in sterile rooms, more forms, and more medical bills filed into corporate procedures. For Evelyn, this meant repeated trips away from the boardroom and into fluorescent hospitals, a life split in two messy halves. She had hired people to run the company when she needed to be at a hospital. Those people had now chosen a narrative that had consequences she could not ignore. The board's patience thinned. An investor called directly and asked if Evelyn was fit to continue leading. Another emailed with subtle threats. "We support the leadership, but must consider fiduciary responsibility." The words felt like knives in a chest already hollowed by worry. Mark, who had tried to protect her, now looked at her with a face full of regret. "I thought I could limit the damage," he said one evening, voice small. "I thought a controlled release would stop things before they festered." "And if it had?" Evelyn asked. "Who was harmed then? The man or the truth?" He had no answer. He only had the knowledge that in his attempt to act for the company, he had become an instrument in a larger calculus. The internal dilemma gnawed at Evelyn in quieter moments. She drafted a confession in her head more than once, a short statement acknowledging haste, an apology to Daniel, a promise to be transparent. Each version had a cost. Each version risked the company, the livelihoods of many, and her own seat. She imagined the headlines and the ripple effects like a pebble dropped in a pond. The splash hitting at the center, the rings expanding outward to jobs and charities and projects that had nothing to do with her mistake. She also imagined Daniel's life, his rent unpaid, his pride bruised, and her throat clenched. She could summon the legal resources, call Rachel, and offer restitution. She could also choose the other route and protect the company by maintaining the chosen narrative, by keeping the frames that supported a swift removal and insisting that the company had acted in good faith. The narrator, impartial and observant, recorded these moments with a ledger's care. Evelyn's lists of drafted apologies, Mark's late-night messages, Sandra's calm insistence on containment, Daniel's meetings with legal aid, the press calls, Luke's small, continuing symptoms. Each entry in the ledger was neutral but not indifferent. They suggested a world in which decisions ripple and people bear the effects. One night, as rain began again and the city's lights trembled behind the glass, Evelyn stood alone in the dark of her apartment and watched Luke sleep. She imagined two futures unfolding from this moment. One where she chose truth and watched consequences fall like sharp rain. Another where she chose cover and tried to preserve a structure that might yet shelter many. Both outcomes hurt. The choice was not abstract. It had a weight that sat on her lungs. She understood now that leadership did not absolve her of moral reckoning. It amplified the cost of every decision. The question that would not leave her was plain and small and devastating. Who would she be when the world asked her to choose between the life of a man with a mop and the life of a company that fed thousands? She had to decide, and every hour that ticked by without her decision tipped the world toward a hazard. The tension escalated into noise. Phone calls, emails, parents in the lobby, a lawyer filing papers, a reporter drafting headlines. The quiet moral problem inside her, once private and soft, had mutated into a public arithmetic that demanded an answer. Evelyn walked into the boardroom like a storm, carrying a single, terrible calm. Rain had stopped. The city outside was a mirror of light and shadow. The glass walls reflected faces she had known for years, some kindly, some sharp, some already calculating how they might survive what came next. The table smelled faintly of coffee gone cold. Her palms were steady. Her voice was steady. She had the full footage on a hard drive. She had the uncut hour every frame Mark had hidden. She had the MRI report, Dr. Mason's handwriting, precise and honest, showing a small lesion near Luke's temporal lobe, a structural issue that explained dizziness and headaches. She had Rachel and Daniel waiting in the corridor, and she had her son's small hand in her pocket, a tight, grounding knot. "Play it," Sandra said before Evelyn spoke, the lawyer's tone already trimmed and ready. Evelyn set the hard drive on the table. The screen filled with the lobby's ordinary geometry, the polished floor, the rows of lockers, the way light folded across a banister. The hour is unspooling like a day in someone else's life. Daniel tied his shoes. Daniel picked up a rag. Daniel straightened a poster. Daniel steadied a crying girl's shoulder. At one point, he steadied Luke as the boy tripped on a threshold. A motion small and protective, the kind of touch a parent or a careful stranger gives. As the frames moved, the room changed. Men and women who had been certain began to look at one another with that thin, disquieting doubt people get when the world's edges soften. William's jaw tightened. Sandra's hand moved to her pen and then stopped. Mark watched Evelyn as if watching the weather shift. Evelyn did not let the screen be the only witness. She placed Dr. Mason's report beside the hard drive and read the conclusions out loud, slow and plain. The lesion, he said, could cause intermittent vertigo and brief loss of balance. A child could trip, fall, or hold his head and not understand why. The contusion seen on the MRI could be from such an episode. It was not a definitive indictment of violence. It was a medical fact offered without drama. "You saw a clip," Evelyn said, looking at Sandra, at William, at Mark. "You chose to shape the story from that clip. You chose a short, sharp moment and let it stand for an hour. You turned a man's life into a narrative that fit your needs." Sandra's eyes were cold and clever. "We sought to protect the company," she said. "We acted in good faith." Good faith. Daniel's voice, when he entered with Rachel at his side, was small but steady. He stood in the doorway, like someone called back into sunlight after being shut in. They took my job on a clip. They didn't ask me. They didn't listen. His hands were bare, a man with nothing hidden. I only tried to help the kids. I swear it. The room tightened around Daniel's words. He did not need to shout. His calm made the accusation sharper. Evelyn felt tears at the rim of her eyes, not only for shame, but for the raw exposure of truth. She had let fear make a decision that had been cruel in its swiftness. William rose from his seat like someone trying to steady a ship. His voice was practiced. We had to act quickly. Investor confidence, shareholder pressure. You acted to protect your position, Evelyn said. You acted to shape a narrative that would reduce risk to you. That is different from protecting anyone's safety. Her voice did not shout. It cut. Sandra's facade flinched. A message thread, one Evelyn had recovered from Mark's tablet, lay on the table like evidence. Evelyn tapped it and let the messages be read aloud by the silence in the room. Pull the clip. We need something simple. Handled. Reputation intact. The words were clinical and small. They sounded worse out loud. Mark had the decency to step forward. I thought I was protecting Evelyn and the company, he said, voice hoarse. I thought a clear message would stop this. I hid the full footage because I wanted to spare her pain. It was not an excuse that closed wounds. It was the confession of someone who had made a wrong in the name of good. The betrayal stacked itself into a shape. A board member willing to risk a man's livelihood to shore up markets. A lawyer ready to cut moral corners for damage control. An assistant who trusted procedure over truth. The room smelled suddenly of old coffee and the metallic tang of fear. You will make a statement now, Evelyn said. All of it. The full footage. The medical report. An apology. Reinstatement and compensation for Daniel, with guarantees of job security and a program to protect other workers from this kind of erasure. And Sandra, she looked at Sandra with a softness that was not mercy but resolve. You will step back from counsel while this is reviewed. Sandra's face, expert at argument, had nowhere to go. William's color had drained. A chair scraped as the board's power shifted like a tide. Investors on the other side of the world would not like the turbulence, but Evelyn's voice carried a different currency than market comfort. It carried the cost of truth. Daniel's eyes met Evelyn's. There was anger there, a slow rise like a tide, but also something else, the relief of being seen. He stepped forward and, with a steadiness Evelyn would not have expected, offered his hand. I don't want spectacle, he said. I want my job back. I want to be seen as someone who does right by the kids. I want my name cleared. Evelyn took his hand. Her grip was small, apologetic, exact. You will have it, she said. She set it into the room, into the recorder, into the cameras that Mark, obeying now, had turned on. The statement would go live. The uncut hour would be posted. The lawyer's notes would be handed to the press. The company would be forced to face the consequence of its choices, and Evelyn would take what came. That night, the cameras turned to her. She spoke without the measured legalese she had been trained in. She spoke with the rough honesty of someone who had broken and wanted to mend. She apologized to Daniel, to his family, to the janitorial staff, to the community. She admitted haste. She admitted failure. She told the truth about the medical finding and what it meant for interpreting a single image. She promised a review of company policy and an independent oversight committee to prevent selective editing of evidence. The words were heavy and simple and real. William resigned in the days after, his private interests exposed in subsequent inquiry. Sandra was suspended pending review. Mark offered to step down, but Evelyn would not accept that. She knew he had been misguided by loyalty, dangerous, yes, but not malign. She would, instead, reorganize, building structures that made hidden choices harder to make. The media pulsed with reaction. Some called her brave. Some called her foolish. Some demanded more. Evelyn took it all like the weather. She had traded the safe path for the honest one and knew there would be storms. At the hospital, Luke slept with his small hand resting against Evelyn's. The lesion required surgery, Dr. Mason said, careful and real. The operation was risky, and the nights ahead would be long. Those were facts no one could guise with press releases. Evelyn felt fear, but it was edged now with purpose. Daniel returned to work the following week. He walked into the lobby and held a mop like a man who had reclaimed a part of his life. People in the building who had avoided his eyes now met him with a slow apology of strangers who had been taught to look away. Evelyn watched him from her office window, the city smaller in that moment, and felt a new kind of responsibility ripple through her. In the quiet hours after, when Luke slept and the city was a map of dull lights, Evelyn sat with the narrator's dual voice in her head, part impartial ledger, part fierce, aching mother. She had learned that truth had weight, that leadership meant more than protecting markets, that the smallest decisions could cut lives. She had learned that power could do harm in the name of protection, and that repair required more than words. She opened a drawer and took out the small blue sock she had kept. She held it like a relic, and thought of the man who had walked out with his plastic bag, the man she had helped unmake. She thought of how easy it had been to let fear choose for her. She thought of how hard it would be to live with that, and try to be better. Outside, the city breathed and did not forgive or condemn. Inside, a child's small hand curled around her finger. Evelyn let herself feel the ache and the relief. Both could exist. She had faced the worst of what her power could do, and had chosen to unmake it. The future would be uncertain, but the present was honest. She did not know if her choice would keep her company whole. She only knew she would answer for what she had done, and that for now felt like the only right path forward. The days after the statement felt like walking through a city after rain. The air smelled clean in a way that did not mean anything had been fixed. It only meant the surface had been washed. People spoke in different tones around Evelyn now. Some voices were soft with support. Others kept the careful distance of those who count risk before loyalty. The cameras had moved on to other stories, but the small, sharp consequences of what had happened did not leave as quickly as the headlines. Luke's surgery was the immediate truth. Dr. Mason had explained the risks with a surgeon's plainness and a father's careful hands. The lesion on Luke's temporal lobe required precision and time. Evelyn sat in the waiting room while machines hummed and nurses walked like quiet clocks. Her hands had stopped trembling by then, not because fear had left, but because it had been reshaped into a kind of readiness. She could no longer hide from the fact that her rush had cost someone his job and that her son's body needed repair. Those two facts lived in her together, heavy and inevitable. The surgery was long, and when the surgeon finally came out, Evelyn's knees almost gave out. Dr. Mason's face was tired but steady. "We did what we could," he said. "There's a good chance of recovery. We'll have to watch him closely." The words were relief dressed in caution. Evelyn cried in a way that had nothing to do with press statements or shareholder value. Only the raw, private unspooling of a mother who had feared losing a child and had to accept that she had also harmed another life to protect him. Daniel returned to the building on a damp morning with a small, careful dignity. The mop in his hand looked like an ordinary tool and like something reclaimed. People who had glanced away now offered small nods. Some came to apologize in awkward, human ways. Evelyn sought him out with a truth she had not had the courage to offer earlier. Not a statement written for lawyers, but a hand extended in shame and an attempt at repair. "I am sorry," she said simply. The words felt too small and then, in their smallness, honest. "I should have looked longer. I should have asked you. I should have protected you from being made invisible." Daniel studied her face, then nodded. He did not ask for grand gestures. He asked only for his name to be cleared and for his work to be restored with dignity. Hartwell set up compensation and a public apology. Evelyn insisted on policies to protect staff from knee-jerk decisions, an independent review for any disciplinary action involving allegations of sensitive misconduct, mandatory access to full footage for any person accused, and a worker advocate office that reported to an outside board. These changes were not a cure for everything. They were a new frame in which fewer lives might be cut by quick judgments. The board's composition changed. William left with a press release and a private chastening. Sandra was suspended while an ethics inquiry reviewed her conduct. Mark, raw with regret, stayed, but under a new mandate. Transparency in all communications and a clear chain of custody for any evidence used in public statements. He volunteered for the oversight committee Evelyn established. It felt strange to both ask for his resignation and keep him close, but Evelyn had learned that punishment without a path to reform can hollow the heart just as easily as secrecy can hollow trust. Internally, the company moved as if walking through fog. The stock dipped then steadied. Some partners left. New hires came with questions and wariness. The cultural shift Evelyn pushed for was slow. Policies can be written quickly. Habits take longer to change. She held meetings where she listened more than she spoke. She insisted that empathy be part of leadership training, that legal teams learn to ask questions before they draft containment memos, that PR teams consider human cost before headlines. There were rollouts and training modules and awkward sessions with staff who had never been asked to consider how their work touched lives. In the quiet moments, Evelyn lived with the dual voice she had come to recognize, the ledger voice that cataloged facts and the aching voice that refused to be neat. The ledger said that the company had regained stability, that legal exposure was managed, that shareholder confidence returned, slowly and not without cost. The other voice counted small, private things. A janitor's dignity returned, a mother's apology given without guardrails, a child's slow steps as he relearned balance. There were nights when she could not sleep. She would go to Luke's room, sit by the light, and watch his chest move in the slow, small rhythm of sleep. Sometimes she held the blue sock she had kept, a tiny relic of the days when decisions felt like clean lines. She thought of Daniel walking out with his bag. The shame settled into his shoulders. She thought of Mark, who had tried to protect her and instead had become an agent of harm. She thought of Sandra, who had chosen expediency over humanity. None of them were monsters. They were people who had made choices under pressure. The scale of outcome made their small errors into large consequences. Evelyn wrote no long memoirs and allowed no grand gestures meant for cameras. Instead, she returned to simple acts, visiting the maintenance staff, listening to stories about livelihoods, attending town hall meetings where janitors and admin staff could speak openly. She fought for a fund that would help workers through temporary losses if something like this happened again, an admission that mistakes will be made even under careful policy, but that a system should not make those mistakes permanent. Luke's recovery was slow. There were days of progress and setbacks. He relearned some things, how his body listened to him, how to stop when dizziness came. He asked fewer questions about why men had walked out of buildings and more about whether hugs could be permanent. Evelyn answered honestly in child language, which is both simple and true. People make mistakes. Some hurt on purpose, some without knowing. We will try to do better. He accepted that answer with the small faith children have. It was not perfect, but it was honest. Public reaction remained mixed. Some praised Evelyn for owning the mistake. Others accused her of damage, control cloaked in contrition. Both were true enough. She accepted the complexity. She had not become a saint. She had become a person who knew the cost of hurried power and wanted to change the ledger she would one day leave behind. The moral question she carried was raw and constant. When power can protect many, does it justify the harm to one? She had once believed in swift action as the highest form of protection. Now she understood that speed without context can become its own cruelty. The tension between responsibility to many and duty to the vulnerable had no neat resolution. It required constant work, rules that favored truth over ease, and leaders willing to be visible when consequences fell. Months later, in a small, quiet moment, Evelyn stood in the lobby and watched Daniel pass with a mop over his shoulder. He smiled, a brief, human thing. She smiled back. There was no fanfare. There was only the small repair of a life resuming. She felt relief and sorrow braided together. Relief that a wrong had been named and, at least in part, corrected. Sorrow for the ease with which harm had been allowed to happen. She kept the blue sock folded in a drawer now, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Power, she thought, is a tool. In the wrong hands or the hurried mind, it becomes a blade. The real work of leadership was not to be undisputed or safe. It was to be careful, to listen to the small sounds that matter, and to repair when mistakes are made. That was the lesson she could not teach in a memo. It had to be felt over and over in the slow act of making amends. Outside, the city moved in its indifferent rhythm. Inside, a child's laugh broke the silence, and Evelyn let it fill the room. She had chosen a harder path. Repair over concealment. It would not erase what had been done, but it might, she hoped, make a world where fewer people woke one morning to find their lives altered by a single frame. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.